They walked off the job with two aims: to protest against the coup and cripple the economy. Across Myanmar, more than 800 people have been killed by security forces since the military overthrew the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi.
Before the coup, there were already 2.8 million Burmese people who were experiencing food insecurity. The UN's World Food Programme says that's more than doubled since the military takeover.
The international community has mostly looked to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to find a resolution to the conflict, but the final ASEAN summit for the year concluded this month without a breakthrough.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. Before we start the show, just a quick reminder that in addition to our podcast feed, we also sponsor events in physical spaces like live podcasts, panel discussions, and programs featuring art, music, film, and other such mediums. And we host live events online as well, where listeners are welcome to join in. Check out our website to see if we have any live events coming to a place near you, or any virtual events that you can also join in. Or maybe you have an idea for collaboration, and if that's the case, feel free to get in touch with us and share your thoughts. But for now, let's get into today's show.
And welcome back. We have the fortune of being joined by Australia's former ambassador to Myanmar, Nicholas Coppel, who will be discussing his experiences in Myanmar, his thoughts and insights onto the international community and the role that diplomacy and politics can play and should play within the ongoing crisis. And will hopefully be giving us some insights into the content of the book that he's recently released. But before we get into all of that, thank you very much for joining us, Nicholas. I really appreciate the insight that you can give us and give our audience. It's a very unique sort of skill set that you have and knowledge base that you're coming from. But I want to give you first just the opportunity to introduce yourself and sort of give your resume to the audience who might not be familiar with you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to join you. Yes, I was Australia's ambassador to Myanmar from the start of 2015 until the end of 2018. So that's a period which covered the elections of 2015 and the transfer of power from the previous government to the National League for Democracy government under Aung San Suu Kyi. I'm a career diplomat. I have been in the Foreign Service for about 40 years. I've had postings previously to the United States, Washington, D.C., also to the Philippines as Deputy Ambassador, to Papua New Guinea as Deputy High Commissioner, and I headed a state-building peacekeeping mission in the Solomon Islands, and then I had my posting to Myanmar. And of course, in between times back in Canberra, which we call capital punishment in the diplomatic corps, and also in secondment to the Prime Minister's department. And more recently, I've obviously left the Foreign Service, and I'm happy to join you today.
Excellent. I mean, it's quite a resume, and I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. This is just something I've always heard, and I'm wondering about it. Postings to countries like the United States, are those considered to be particularly high value postings that are given to particularly meritorious people within the service, or what's the culture there? That's always been the impression that I've received.
Well, it'll depend from different foreign services. In some countries, it's a system of patronage. I would say, though, in the case of Australia, it's Washington for us is a very demanding post, as it is for a number of other embassies that take the relationship very seriously, and it does attract good people to it, but it also places strong, it's a heavy workload, so it's quite a demanding post in that sense, but also very rewarding.
Okay, I can imagine. And was Myanmar your first posting as ambassador, or had you been ambassador previously?
Well, technically, my position in the Solomon Islands, which was heading the regional assistance mission to Solomon Islands, is deemed what we would call a head of mission, but doesn't have the title of ambassador because it was a regional mission, not an ambassadorial role. But it had the same level as ambassador in our foreign service, pay scales and so on.
I understand. I understand. So then, looking specifically at the time that you spent in Myanmar, so you say you were there from 2015, and of course, uh, hopefully the audience would remember there were the very controversial 2010 elections that were boycotted, and then of course a sort of military backed government comes into power notionally democratically, and then 2015 there was I was in Australia at the time. I sort of remember those of us who were keeping an eye on politics in Myanmar. There was a lot of skepticism. It looked like, oh wow, the NLD won, and then I remember a lot of people were just sort of making offhanded jokes like, yeah, the NLD won. Like, I wonder how long before they just get rearrested and thrown in prison, and all these things. And then the NLD actually takes their seats in Parliament, and everyone's just sort of stopped and gone, oh wow, all right. What was it like for you? Like, I never had the privilege of seeing it up close, but I'm just wondering, what was the feeling like? What were the thoughts like? What did people think was actually going to happen?
Well, I think there were different views amongst different people. I think we were of the view that the election results would be upheld. We didn't have anything to suggest that they wouldn't. But I know, we had a number of meetings with Aung San Suu Kyi prior to the election, and she was quite anxious about the upcoming elections at that time in 2015. And we had a number of meetings at her house at University Avenue, and she really wanted, this is us being a number of diplomatic missions and international agencies, including those that are providing support to the election process. And she wasn't, I think, convinced that it was going to be a free and fair election. And yet most of, if not everyone around the table, was trying to reassure her that all the assistance that was being provided seemed very genuine, as in those seeking it were interested in having free and fair elections and conducting them well. There were a number of international observers and observer teams which had been invited into the country, and everything seemed to be set for a genuine election. So I don't think we were surprised, but she might have been.
I mean, it's really interesting that you're looking at situations in ways that the people who are even more deeply involved might not be able to fully see and fully appreciate, because you just have that very different, very unique perspective.
Well, I think it's also, she has suffered, over 15
Mm,
years of house arrest by these very same people.
yes.
And she'd also, came very close to having, an attempt on her life being successful.
Yes.
So, for her to be having a bit of a trust deficit with Myanmar's military, I think coming from her background is not a surprising situation. But, we came as diplomats, most of us arriving after a period of remarkable reforms under the previous government. I mean, not complete, didn't go all the way, but still quite a change from what had preceded them. And, business was coming in, a number of diplomatic missions, new ones were being established in the country, and the openness to the internet and to mobile telephony and so on. It was quite a period of excitement and a feeling throughout the country of change. And so that's what we arrived into and, if you like, absorbed or adopted, while she had a longer memory, obviously, and a longer experience of the generals. And indeed, she was proved to be right second time round.
Unfortunately, yes. And so I wonder the other side of things, because it's fascinating to understand the Myanmar politics side, but as an ambassador, you obviously represent Australia. You represent Australia's interests in Myanmar, by extension within the broader region. And I'm just wondering especially during that period of time after the 2015 election win and the NLD government taking their seats, and prior to the coup, in that very, I think, that window of rapid change and optimism, what were Australia's foreign policy objectives with regards to Myanmar? Was Australia hoping to establish trade? Was it getting a toehold of some sort of political toehold in Southeast Asia, regional stability? Like, what really was your overarching mission?
No, I mean, I think it was a lot simpler. I mean, Australia's interests in Myanmar are fairly, the bilateral interests aren't strong in terms of business and investment. It's and nor do we, carry on like a superpower with global geostrategic objectives. Our interests in Myanmar were very much for the country itself, and what was best for the country, and seeing a peaceful transition, seeing Myanmar assume its a more responsible and productive role in the international community of nations and in regional organizations such as ASEAN. Uh, and one less trouble spot within the region was very much what our objectives were. We then had a development assistance program to support that, a program which had grown quite rapidly, but primarily designed to support Myanmar in its reform program. There were some business interests. We had two large Australian companies with investments in Myanmar, the first being Woodside Petroleum, which had offshore gas exploration permits, and ANZ Bank, which was the first foreign bank to get to be awarded a banking license in Myanmar. So they were the two. But compared to our major trading partners, the volume of trade is really small. And while of course we're always interested in growing that, I don't think the prospects for trade were ever seen. They weren't driving our position there because we never saw the prospects as being particularly large. And one of the reasons for that is the similarities between the two economies. I mean, both are resource economies, natural resources, as in oil and gas, which Australia has in abundance, and also in agriculture. So, when you've got that similarity, you end up not trading so much with each other, but with countries that don't have those things, and countries which are producing the things which Australia needs, which are not to be found in Myanmar. So, from that sort of very basic assessment, it wasn't a trade and investment sort of self-interest driving our concern for Myanmar. It was, a larger, bigger picture about Myanmar's place in the world and in the region, and peace and stability. I would add to that, though, there are two specific areas where we had concerns and still do in relation to Myanmar. And one of those is the irregular outflow of refugees. So, as a source country for many people seeking asylum on very dangerous boat trips, some reaching Malaysia, some reaching Indonesia, some coming as far as Australia. So we're concerned for certainly the migration program to Australia to be one which is a regulated one and not have irregular arrivals. It's been a concern of the Australian government. And the second, of course, relates to narcotics. Myanmar was one of the largest, either the largest or second largest producing nation of opium, and the main source of heroin coming into Australia, and then more recently methamphetamines as well. So we had concerns in relation to those two, and a desire to be having a relationship with the government which would enable us to cooperate to help address both those concerns.
Although I imagine that would be very, very difficult, because particularly when it comes to the narcotics trade, I understand that in some of the cases, the narcotics were being produced and trafficked by EAOs or various armed organizations that had the tacit blessing and protection of the Tatmadaw, but in many other cases, they were armed organizations that were and continue to be pointedly opposed to the Tatmadaw. So you would, as a diplomat, what options do you have if you're dealing with the civilian government and with the military? Do you have the ability to attempt to deal directly with organizations that the central authority has deemed to be enemies of the state and separatists, or do you only have the ability to go through the central authority? Because if they haven't been able to control the drug trade that brings money to the people that they view to be their enemies in the past, what hope do you really have of finding a way for them to be able to achieve that?
Well, the only approach we have is through Myanmar authorities, and indeed, the Australian Federal Police have had a relationship with the Myanmar police force for quite some time, and a relationship which included having agents stationed in the embassy. So the cooperation is at the police to police level. That's not without its critics who see, the Myanmar police as being responsible for part of the suppression which had occurred in Myanmar. But it's for us, it's about trying to quarantine the cooperation. So it's not providing assistance to the Myanmar police force in terms of arms or an ability to use lethal force or train them in that. But it is about seeking to get intelligence from them on drug trafficking routes, so that even if narcotics are being produced in ethnic armed organization areas, those narcotics need to be transported. And discovering what those transport links are or routes are, and having a capacity then to interdict them is clearly an objective. And it's one which could be pursued, and there are a number of successes there. But Myanmar also, would frequently be having, big bonfires of seized narcotics. So that is one of the objectives of the Myanmar government, and this is the government prior to National League for Democracy as well. That's not to say that other elements within the Myanmar establishment, whether it be the Tatmadaw or the police, were not involved in drug trafficking, but we're not stopping the entire industry. We don't have the capacity to do that, and so there will be elements which we can work with, and they're the ones which we do work with.
Hmm. And I wonder in this, because you're looking at Myanmar and you're going to this country and you're saying, in very polite terms, of course, but you're saying you are a problem for us. You are a source of narcotics, which is a problem for us. And you are a source of, let's say, irregular migrants, which is a problem for us. When you go to a country and you basically say, we take issue with some of the things that are happening, and we would like you to ramp up your efforts and bring about better outcomes for us, what's the sort of other side of the balance? What does that country then receive if they are open to that and say, yes, we recognize that you're in a difficult situation and we will try harder to remedy these problems? What do they stand to gain from that?
Well, as I mentioned, the drugs and narcotics are a problem for Myanmar as well, and so it's a shared objective. But what I'm saying is there will be elements within Myanmar's military who, are stationed in remote areas and are profiting from the drugs trade themselves. But that is not the official position of the government of Myanmar. The government of Myanmar officially is seeking to control narcotics. So, we're dealing with the central authority, and if there are rogue elements which are, who don't have sufficient patronage within their organization to protect themselves, they can be dealt with. So, as I say, it's a shared objective. Some of the benefit to them would be some of the methodologies which we would employ. and when cooperation was at a very strong level under the National League for Democracy, it included the gifting of in these inflatable boats which can be used to check maritime vessels for narcotics.
Okay, so you're going to a country and saying, you're doing a thing, we want you to succeed in doing this thing, we're willing to give you skills and we're willing to give you material to improve your chances of achieving the shared objective. Is that the basic playbook?
Yes, I don't think it's presented in such a transactional way.
Okay.
It is more a cooperative thing where we have a shared objective. But as I say, for us, the principal interest is in gaining intelligence on narcotics trafficking.
Okay.
It's the actual eradication of opium poppy crops in the country is not done by us. It's there's a UN agency which is working again in cooperation with Myanmar authorities that seeks to do that. But there's still narcotics being produced and leaving the country, and that's the element which we were most engaged with.
Interesting. Another thing that I really am sort of fascinated by, because I used to work with I used to teach the military guys back before the coup, and it may have been a translation issue, but they were very much of the mindset that all countries, not just Myanmar, would have a civilian ambassador and a military ambassador. I'm not sure how their embassies work, but the impression I got was that they viewed the military attaché as co-equal to the actual ambassador. And the impression that I got from foreigners working in foreign service was that you really were dealing with two entities. You were dealing with the civilian government and you were dealing with the military establishment, and they're both trying to position themselves as the more important, more significant partner. But of course, I never got that insight. So I'm wondering, how did you experience it? Did you feel that you were dealing with one central state, or that you were dealing with two very different entities within that state? Were they competing with one another, or did they just divide up your areas of interest as an ambassador? And some of the topics would be discussed with civilian government, some of the topics would be discussed with the military.
Well, under Myanmar's constitution, it is what they call a diarchic system of government. And that is, there are some powers and authorities which are vested in the president, and there are other powers and authorities which are vested in the commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief, for example, under the constitution, which they've recently thrown out, but which is the constitution of 2008, the commander-in-chief appoints personally 25% of the members of parliament. They're his personal pick. He also appoints 3 of the ministers in the government. The Minister for Defence, who reports to the Commander-in-Chief, which is the other way around in virtually all other countries. So he appoints the Defence Minister. He appoints the Minister for Home Affairs, which controls the police force and the prisons. And he also appoints the Minister for Border Affairs, where the military is largely engaged in conflict with a number of the ethnic armed organisations. So all the firearms, all the coercive force of the state is under the control of the Commander-in-Chief. There is not a firearm in any institution which reports to a civilian. So it's a very, as I say, it's a diarchic system. It's a power-sharing system, and it needs to be seen as such. In terms of whom we engage with, it's primarily almost exclusively with the civilian side of government. That's partly because attempts to have meetings with the military are very difficult to secure. I think in my 4 years, I had possibly 3 meetings with the Commander-in-Chief, and that's not for want of trying. And then to access to other senior generals is very difficult, other than regional commanders. So if I was making a visit to a province, a state which had a regional commander, I would usually call on the regional commander or seek a call on the regional commander and to discuss the situation in his patch. But other than that, it was very difficult to have meetings with military personnel. They were a world to themselves, and they were, in retrospect, you see them not really buying into this notion of a civilian government and dealing with civilians.
Yeah. I got that very strong sense from them as well. And that then sort of leads into the really big question, and I don't want to phrase this in a way that makes it sound accusatory or anything like that, but the big question is, in the lead up to the coup, is there anything you think that the diplomatic cause of the various Western sort of clearly pro-democratic countries could have done or should have done differently that could potentially have prevented the coup that happened?
Well, you're talking about a period which was after the time I was there. So I'm not too sure what was done, but I think most people, most commentators, indeed most observers of Myanmar military, were of the view that the constitution was, a military creation, and the system they had is the one that they wanted, and that they wouldn't then overthrow it. So in terms of, I don't think it was expected. I think like in 2000 and after the elections of 2015, similarly after the elections of 2020, the expectation was that that there wouldn't be an obstacle to the successful candidates taking their seats in Parliament. I think if perhaps if we had been able to form closer relationships with the military, we might have got a better sense of their thinking, better sense of how they felt about another term of Aung San Suu Kyi, a state councillor. We know they weren't, particularly Min Aung Hlaing, the commander-in-chief, was not happy at attempts to amend the constitution to provide for a lesser role for the military in the political life of the nation, and attempts to amend the constitution to enable Aung San Suu Kyi to become president, because they had written into the constitution provisions which precluded her. So there was talk of amending the constitution to change that. But constitutional change is particularly difficult in Myanmar. It requires 75% plus one votes in the parliament. And as I mentioned before, the commander-in-chief personally appoints 25% of the members of parliament. So he has, if you like, a veto on constitutional amendment. But there, the Aung San Suu Kyi had shown the commander-in-chief that there are ways of working around some of these things. And the way that she did it after the 2015 elections, she was precluded from becoming president, but turned around and created this position of state councillor. Now, state councillor is not a position which is provided for in the constitution. So it had it was a rather a strange way of doing things. And but kept also she could become Minister for Foreign Affairs, so she had a seat in the National Security Committee as well. And I think that sort of blindsided them a bit, and it meant that Aung San Suu Kyi could take on a role which the people saw as equivalent to president, and even though she wasn't called president. So it defeated their intent, which was to stop her from having such a role. So when there's they became aware that the National League for Democracy are working on try other ways to try and amend the constitution. I guess they were suspicious of what might come, but it's in retrospect, it's easy to see what the not easy, easier to see and speculate what the motivations for the coup might have been.
Yeah. Yeah, but so it sounds like what you're saying is that the military establishment never, despite wanting all of that legitimacy, the military establishment never really opened themselves up enough to foreign diplomatic missions to be really influenceable and b transparent enough to be predictable enough from the perspective of outside observers and outside diplomatic corps. Would that be fair?
Yes, that's a very accurate characterization. And indeed, the program that you are working on, which is providing English language training to some, I think, middle level Myanmar military officers, was one attempt to try and build a relationship where there is some benefit to the Myanmar military so that we might get a little bit closer to them. But as I said, those programs were, relatively modest. It was only a few $100,000 and didn't provide them, while they appreciate English language training. Of course, the military are much more concerned to get access to material, to hardware, Western military technology. And of course, that was never on the table. So that training really didn't open doors in the way that we thought it might.
I think in the long term, I think it might have. Full disclosure for the audience, I may have mentioned this in passing. I was involved in an Australian government-backed program to provide English language teaching to, as you say, mid-level members. It was mostly captain rank, some lieutenants, some majors. Also for the police force, the I think immigration and customs as well. But I think those that we actually dealt with, those are the students that we had. I think I would say about 50% of them were open to the Western style of thinking and were open to reform. And you had the standard 50% who were very, loyal to the system as it exists and they don't question it. But I think maybe if the programs had continued and those individuals had risen through the ranks and we maintained rapport with those people, I think that could have paid dividends. But as it was, I think they were very, the people we were working with were so powerless, I think, within the infrastructure of the military. They had no real pull, they had no real power. They did what they were told to do when they were told to do it, and quite a lot of them, I think, were just looking to get out of the military as quickly as they could. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what could have been, but it's nice thinking. But anyway, so let's jump forward then to post coup, and obviously, as you say, you were posted to Myanmar until 2018, so this is all way past your tenure. But one of the really big things is that the Australian ambassador, there isn't one, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but Australia has chosen not to reappoint an ambassador to Myanmar. Is that a normal thing for a state to do, or would that be considered a very strong gesture?
Well, it's not a normal thing. I mean, it is a gesture, it is a signal. And when what has happened when, and a number of countries, almost all the European countries and the North American countries, and indeed some in the region as well, have done, is when their ambassador, this is in the period following the coup, when their resident ambassador has come to the end of their term, the replacement has been put in at what they call chargé d'affaires level. And the difference primarily is that an ambassador, one, you have to get the agreement of the receiving country before you can send an ambassador, and so you avoid the need to get that. It's called agrément. And secondly, when an ambassador arrives, the ambassador is carrying they call letters of credence, or the credentials, and these are presented in a very formal ceremony to the head of state. So in post-coup Myanmar, that presentation would be to Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing. And many countries, including Australia, have wished to avoid that acknowledgement of Min Aung Hlaing as the head of state. And one way of doing that is to not appoint an ambassador. And when you have a chargé d'affaires, there's simply a letter of introduction, which is sent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So you avoid that meeting, and it's a signal. And is it a strong one? Well, it's an unambiguous one, but it's not strong in the sense of being coercive. It doesn't push Myanmar to change in any particular direction. I mean, it's more from their point of view, it's more a slight than a pressure.
Yes, but so the chargé d'affaires does have all of the abilities of the ambassador. So in terms of having diplomatic channels open, the chargé d'affaires would functionally be the same as having an ambassador, correct?
Well, it's a little bit less. I mean, obviously, an ambassador has a certain standing and status. Ministers would be more willing to see an ambassador than a chargé d'affaires. But in the current climate, certainly the Australian embassy and a number of other embassies have deliberately and consciously kept to a barest of minimums their contact with ministers and government in Naypyidaw, for want of not wishing to acknowledge it or to see it as a normal situation. There are some matters that are transactional which do need to take place, but they are the bare minimum. So that level of cooperation, that building of relationships that took place before, is not taking place now. Now, if you wanted to build those relationships, having an ambassador would certainly help. But in the current set of circumstances, it really isn't an issue. And a chargé d'affaires can do all the other things which an ambassador needs to do in terms of managing the mission, relationships with the business community, if there are any of them left in the country, with UN agencies and the cooperation that takes place there, the delivery of humanitarian assistance, for example. So those sorts of and others, and civil society bodies that are still operating in the country. That sort of work continues, but it's a much lesser relationship because the formal government to government relationship hasn't been severed, but it has certainly been much reduced.
Mm. And so now we come to sort of the meat of the discussion and a much more sort of controversial topic. Now I know that your position, and I will obviously allow you to state your position the way that you think is best, but your position seems to be that a lot of the outrage that exists towards the diplomatic community, towards international governments, towards international companies for having engagement with the regime such as it exists is not only misplaced, but is in fact counterproductive. And that there is a lot of, I think you term it as well as citizen diplomacy. There's a lot of diplomatic work that is being done that is not being recognized by a lot of the commentators, is not being given its due sort of respect. So to just get the ball rolling on this, I want to ask you what role do you think would be appropriate for a country, for example Australia, to have in the Myanmar context currently when it comes to the regime?
Yeah, I think to put it most simply, when something terrible happens in a country like in Myanmar, the coup d'etat, the reaction of a number of people outside the country is pretty much like, the cancel culture. You don't have any contact. You've got to pull out. You don't go there on holidays. You don't do anything. And, on one level, you can understand that. It's, terrible things are happening in the country and, you can't treat it as business as usual. But my concern is also for the people of Myanmar. There's 54 million people in the country who are suffering under this military dictatorship. And I think it's useful for us, before we take measures or to think about what impact what we're going to do is going to have on those people, the innocent people of Myanmar. I mean, their lives already are enormously difficult. The military is slashing expenditure on health and education to pay for its defense forces' repression of its own people. And it's, they're suffering from the repression. They're suffering from reduced health and education outcomes. For companies, for example, to pull out of Myanmar and to lay off all their workers, for people to stop buying products which are made in Myanmar because the regime there is terrible. Again, that it can harm the people more than it can harm the regime. So, I mean, what I'm saying really is, we need to think through what our opposition to the regime should be and what it should be like. And there's been a lot of criticism of some international companies for staying in the country, and the pressure is mounted, and a number have pulled out. I mean, the leading mobile telephony provider, Telenor from Norway, for example, withdrew and sold its business, to another company which has a terrible reputation and will have no hesitancy in complying with all the requirements of the military, which is surveillance equipment being installed, data, on phone calls, who called whom, when, transferring of funds, which money was transferred over the mobile network, and so on. And so it's been, it's a deterioration in the security and safety for the people. And yes, okay, the company's pulled out, but it's made things worse, not better. Similarly, Chevron and Total, who were engaged in gas production, and one of the partners in the gas production was the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, which has now come under the military command, and it gets a share of the revenues or the profits from the venture. And so, Total and Chevron get criticized for this, and they decide to withdraw. And they, there's no buyer, no foreign company wishes to buy their share, so they gift it to the other shareholders. The result, the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise percentage of the take from these gas wells has gone up, not down. So instead of starving the regime of foreign exchange and funds, it's only enhanced it. But the company, is very concerned about its reputation, concerned about shareholder activism, and so on, and gets pushed into these positions. So I think, I'm one of the people who's very concerned about developments in Myanmar, but I think when we think about what can we do as individuals or institutions, I think it's more helpful to be, rather than negative and criticizing what other people are doing or not doing, to think of what can we do and how can we help the agents for change who are within Myanmar. It's not the companies that have left. It's not the people who have left Myanmar who are going to change Myanmar. It's the ones who have remained. The power is with them. So how can we support them? How can we help in the delivery of education from distance learning, for example? How can we contribute to medical services, for example, where people can dial in or dial to a service provider who can guide, listen to what the symptoms are and provide advice over the phone or over the internet. So there's multiple ways. It's really important. The media, for example, independent media in Myanmar has been completely eliminated. And there are a number of media organizations which are trying to continue to provide reporting on Myanmar, but doing it primarily from border areas or from Thailand. And these all need to be supported, and it's an ongoing support that's required. There's a lot of the border areas, there's a lot of territory which ethnic organizations have seized control over, for example. and are seeking to provide the health and education services. These cost money, and there isn't a taxation or a revenue base for these groups. So, there is a lot that can be done that's more positive, and I think too often we in the West are concerned with criticism rather than looking for more constructive ways of providing assistance. So I think, if I may, that characterizes my approach to the situation to post-coup Myanmar.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to sort of investigate that a little bit more, because when you talk about, for example, we can talk about exile media, we can talk about Mizima and DVB and these organizations that's mostly based in Chiang Mai in Thailand. I think, like very few people would say there's anything untoward about supporting these organizations. I mean, they're outside of the country. But if we're talking about providing telehealth, as you say, it's very high value. If we're talking about providing, and not even telehealth, but even things like vaccines and medications, if we're talking about providing telecommunications, we're talking about providing education opportunities. Full disclosure, I work for the Spring University in Myanmar. And if we're talking about ultimately putting money in the pockets of people who have to pay rent, who have to put food on the table, things like this, do you think that there is a way in which these things can be done without somehow empowering the military? Because if we put money in the pockets of workers, I think we don't disagree that conventionally the military is going to take a very large slice of that pie, and they will be turning that money into weapons that they will use to continue killing people. Is there a way, you think, to avoid that, or do we have to do some sort of calculation to figure out how much damage, in dollar terms, are we giving the military versus how much food, electricity, utilities, medical care, rent are we giving the people themselves?
Well, I think it will vary. I mean, there are some companies, for example, which renting office space in a high-rise building, which is on land which is owned by one of the Myanmar military's economic holding companies, and so the rent that they pay for that floor space, some of it ends up, goes to the landlord, of course, and then some of it goes in rent to the owner of the land. I suspect it's a very small contribution, and I don't think it's a reason for the company to withdraw from the country. In other cases, we have a lot of the garment industry, for example, which employs hundreds of thousands of workers, predominantly female, overwhelmingly female, and many of them have moved in from rural areas into urban areas to seek a better life. A number of the large retailers, the fast retailers, do contract manufacturing in Myanmar. So they don't have their own factories there, but they have contractual relationships with factory owners who employ these Myanmar citizens, making these fast garments, which are then sold, in the rest of the world. Now they, this is an industry which has come under a lot of scrutiny for exploitation of workers in third world countries. So they have processes in place to ensure, there's a human rights due diligence process to ensure not just that their employees are being treated adequately, but also that their contractors' employees are being adequately treated. So which relates to, how many breaks they get in a day, how much lighting there is in the factory, our number of hours worked, and so on. Their right to form trade unions, for example, is also an important consideration. Now, that due diligence is now being very difficult to conduct. And so the argument is being put, because you cannot conduct that due diligence, you should not be sourcing from Myanmar. And a number of these large retailers have agreed with that and are cancelling their contracts for manufacturing in Myanmar, and tens of thousands of workers are being laid off. It's again, it's one of those situations where we really have to think through what the consequences of our actions or attitudes might be. But when those companies are buying or contracting for production in Myanmar, the amount of revenue that goes to the government of Myanmar isn't large. I mean, the contract is with a commercial supplier, another contractor. They're paying the wages of these workers. That's where most of the funds goes in wages and salaries. I think where it is in the oil and gas sector where the volume of funds going to the government and therefore to the military is greatest.
And with the pullout of Woodside.
Well, Woodside was not in production. Woodside had exploration permits,
Oh, okay.
so it moved away from those.
Okay. But Chevron and Total certainly their exodus.
They exited and consequently increased the revenue that the Myanmar military gets. So a perverse outcome. The share of the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise in those offshore ventures, gas ventures, has increased.
So, okay, see, one would have made the presumption that with Chevron and Total leaving the country, the military doesn't have the same capacity to exploit the natural resources because they don't have the expertise and they don't have the resources necessary to do that. So are you indicating that everything, as Chevron and Total left, everything stayed the same? It's just that the industry is now essentially entirely nationalized and the money is not being
No,
sent or
because
received.
there are other partners as well, including
Okay.
from Thailand and the government-owned Thai petroleum company,
Okay.
which took on the operating role.
Mm.
So Myanmar, the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise was never the operator; it was just, if you like, a passive shareholder.
I see.
So its equity position has increased, and consequently, the revenues it gets from the operation have increased.
Okay. I mean that.
But
Yeah.
and Thailand's unlikely to withdraw. I mean, a lot of the gas that's being produced is transshipped directly into Thailand, and it plays a vital role in Thailand's electricity generation.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that, but that it's still a very interesting consequence to think about. But regardless of that, is there not? I mean, we talk about symbolism because, for example, we spoke about the symbolism of not reappointing the ambassador and having a charge d'affaires. Is there not a symbolic risk that if we tell companies and we tell governments, well, in the interest of protecting workers, in the interest of protecting their positions, we should engage with the regime as the regime currently exists? Do we not run the risk of normalizing and legitimizing the regime and therefore undermining efforts that are being made elsewhere to sort of strangle and starve out the regime in the hopes of allowing democracy to return?
Well, I think a lot of these activities don't involve engaging with the regime. I mean, if it's a Western retailer with a contractual arrangement with a Chinese company which employs, tens of thousands of workers, they would have obtained an investment permit. A lot of it would have been granted under the National League for Democracy government days, but it's not. The government's not a party to the production process there. I think, as I say, the oil and gas is a special case because the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise are joint venture partners in the operation, so there is a relationship there. But in other areas of commercial activity, much less so. I think a new company wishing to invest in Myanmar, of which there are very few, because of a chaotic economic situation which the military has brought upon itself, and because of the violence in many parts of the country, there's very little investment taking place. But if there were to be a proposal for investment, yes, that needs to get foreign investment approval through a ministry. But I don't think for many people who are currently in many foreign businesses or persons who are in Myanmar, there is much contact with the military or military authorities.
It's interesting. Wait, and I think you're correct. We do think of it very much as black and white, that you're always engaging with the military. I think the fear comes from the fact that so many industries within the country are owned by the military, especially through MEHL and MEC, the holding companies in the hands of the military. It seems like an enormous swathe of the economy is held by the military. I think Sean Turnell estimated, back of the envelope, something in the vicinity of about 20-25% of the economy is controlled either directly or indirectly by the military. And so that just makes it very difficult to ascertain whether or not you're contributing money to the pockets of the military. But so you seem to basically be saying that even if you are engaging with an industry that is under military ownership, the number of dollars that are going to make it to the pockets of the military are, you're saying, comparatively low.
Yeah, there was a UN report into foreign companies which had relationships with military-owned companies, and it found, I think from memory, 13 companies had joint venture operation. Foreign companies had joint venture operations with Myanmar military organizations, and all of those were neighboring countries in Asia. So, there just hasn't been the connection with Myanmar's military business connections that many people thought. And, it's not too surprising. I mean, it's been a country which has been going backwards for a very long time under military rule. There's been a stigma in terms of dealing with Myanmar for many decades. So very few foreign companies actually got into joint ventures with the Myanmar military holding companies. Their business interests are extensive, but they were in running hotels, transport companies, cement manufacture, gemstones, jade mining, those sorts of activities. So not a lot of activities of those business interests of the Myanmar military companies, and banking as well, and transport. A lot of them were very domestically focused rather than internationally focused, and they were in competition with privately run ones. So it's not always necessary to have a dealing with a Myanmar military-owned company.
It's fair enough, and I know that you do discuss some of these concepts that we've just brought up in your book, Myanmar's Digital Coup. But I'm just wondering, like, on that, just the title of the book alone, why did you call it Myanmar's Digital Coup?
Well, we called it. I mean, it's co-authored with Associate Professor Lennon Chang from Deakin University. It's called Myanmar's Digital Coup to draw attention that the role of the internet has played in the coup. It's been used as a tool to promote fear and repression, but it's also been a tool to organize resistance against the coup. And in many ways, I think the internet and digital technology characterizes or explains why this coup has been different from previous coups. And it begins with the opening of Myanmar to the internet and to mobile telephony in 2011 or 12. When the price of a SIM card dropped from $2,000 US dollars down to almost free in 2015. And everybody, with cheap handsets from China, suddenly got access to the internet, and in particular to Facebook. But it also opened them up to new ideas. It opened them up to mobile banking to a country which is seriously underbanked, and people were able to transfer funds and money across the country for the first time. It was played a large part in the awakening of the population to the outside world. So it had that. It set the scene, if you like, and it then became, it's obviously been used extensively as a tool for spreading information about, what's happening in Myanmar. So, the coup takes place, the whole country becomes aware of it, even if media is being controlled. And the response to the coup has been throughout the country, unlike previous coups, which were largely confined to Yangon and Mandalay. So it's played a critical role there. It's played a critical role in many fundraising activities for the resistance to the coup, and indeed, and also for the fundraising and transferring of funds. But similarly, the military has been very alert to its role and using it for misinformation campaigns, characterizing those who are opposed to the coup as terrorists, for example, and turning off internet access at times when it suits them, and that usually coincides when they're about to mount some gross act of violence against their own people. So prior to, for example, airstrikes on villages, the internet drops off so that people cannot spread information about what's about to happen. If there's some sense of it happening, people cannot be posting up images in real time of what's happening and the destruction that's occurring. So making it harder for those accountability mechanisms. And that's where it's also playing a very useful role. The recording of the disproportionate use of force and the abuses that have been going on, using geolocation tools and chronolocation tools, it's able, this information is being collected, by a number of organizations, but a lot of it's coming together through the Independent Investigative Mechanism on Myanmar, a UN mandated body, to build up this body of evidence so that one day cases can be brought against the people who are responsible for these atrocities. And technology is playing a really important part in the documentation of that evidence, the collection, transmission, and documentation of that evidence. And you've mentioned also, telehealth and telemedicine and education being provided. That too is all being facilitated by digital technology. So it's, in every aspect of the coup, you see how it has become, and the response to the coup, how important technology has been. The training, the learning that many of the resistance groups are getting, is very much, online. People are using it in all sorts of ways.
And just to sort of tie these together, the question that I still have for you is, as a diplomat, looking at the technological revolution, and looking at the role that technology is able to play in what we may not term a failed state, but certainly a state in a very deep crisis. Do you see within this, and do you see within the rapid evolution of technology and its role within the Myanmar crisis, a change in how diplomacy is going to take place or should take place, and new opportunities and new avenues for diplomats to be able to reach out to their governmental counterparts, reach out to the people in the countries where they're trying to, engender goodwill and build international connections, and ways for diplomats to potentially even obtain information from the countries in which they are operating that maybe through official channels they would not have been able to get access to. Do you see a shift in this?
Well, I think there's been a shift took place a long time ago, and the role of an embassy has been much less about providing news on what's happening in the country, and that's been taken up by media. Um, I mean, the technological revolution has only taken that one step further, I suspect. But the embassy and the role of the embassy is much more than reporting on what's happening in the country. It is also very much about analysing what's going on and having a much deeper understanding through better contacts, deeper contacts in the country than often journalists who will be non-resident and sort of fly in for a crisis, for example, and present a story. An embassy can provide a more measured assessment of what's happening. But the embassy, is, as I say, isn't so much about reporting what's going on. It is, the language that's used is to promote and protect the interests of your host country. And that encompasses a lot of things. It's promotion of trade. It's the delivery of development assistance program. In some cases, it's a defense cooperation program. We've talked about police cooperation already. Consular assistance is becoming a very large part of an embassy's work. So providing assistance to your citizens who are in distress for whatever reason. All these activities take place, which are not, they're not challenged by the media or by digital technology. Digital technology enhances your ability to conduct them. We can, more readily be in touch with expert advice in, from your home country, if in a consular case or in for other matters as well. We can get, briefings in much quicker time through the internet than, through the diplomatic bag in the old days. So it's made the work in that sense easier, because you can reach back into government and to your home country for assistance more readily. It has made it harder in the sense that, it's foreshortened the time that people's expectations of you to act and to respond to a particular situation. It's become much more immediate. So you're on call 24/7 as the ambassador. The phone is always with you, and whenever you leave the mission or travel, you have to remain in contact. Either if you're beyond the reach of a mobile phone, you're bringing a satellite phone with you. You can't just leave the country at any point in time. You always have to get permission for that, and there has to be arrangements in place. It's an expectation that the mission is always there and always available, and I think that's there are raised expectations today which have come about through this through technology.
I think it's a very interesting insight and probably a nice thought-provoking stream to end this on. So I want to thank you very much for coming on and for sharing your insights. And I think especially with something like diplomacy and working with the government of Myanmar in that much vaunted NLD, if we can call it that, period, it's something that we speculate about a lot. We talk about it, we wonder about it, but it's so very rare that we can get the insights of someone who was actually there and actually saw it and did it firsthand. So I know that our audience really appreciates everything that you can teach us about that time.
Well, I think I would like to say, Myanmar is a fascinating country. It's had an extraordinary history. It's largely in modern times, a very sad history, but it nevertheless, I think that makes it quite distinct and fascinating in itself. So I would encourage your listeners to remain engaged with Myanmar. I would hate to think that the country and our attention on it and our interest in it is diminished because of the actions of a military general. There are many people in the country living their lives, and I think, it's important not to forget them. And one way not to forget them is to stay abreast of developments there. Change will come. We don't know when, we don't know how, but it will come eventually. And I hope that there are enough people around the world with that interest and passion for Myanmar that will help it re-engage with the international community and re-engage with the country so that it can rebuild itself in better times in the future. But it requires of us today not to forget it and not to forget the people, and to support them in the ways that we can, which we talked about today.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this show. I realize that this is an enormously difficult time for many people who love Myanmar these days, myself included, and at times we might despair that there's nothing at all we can do to stop the horrors unfolding there. However, just the mere fact of staying informed is helping to bear continued witness and keep a focus on this issue when so much of the international media has moved on. And the only way we can do our part in continuing to provide this content is through the support of generous donors, listeners like yourself. If you have found this episode of value and would like to see more shows like it, please consider making a donation to support our efforts. Both monthly pledges or one-time donations are equally appreciated, with all funds going immediately into the production of more episodes. Thank you deeply in advance. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam